The only reason I was standing in a church parking lot at 11:04 on a Tuesday in November, folding metal chairs next to a woman I didn't know, was that my father asked me to be there from a hospital bed and then died before I could ask him why it mattered. My name's Joel Morrow. I'm 37 years old, which means I've spent exactly half my life in dark rooms listening to other people perform. I'm a sound engineer specifically, the kind who gets thanked in very small print on albums that sell very large numbers. The albums you know. The voices you know. My name is in the liner notes with the kerning of an afterthought, somewhere between the mastering technician and the catering company. 3 of those albums went platinum. 1 was nominated for Album of the Year. I watched that ceremony from my apartment with a beer I hadn't bothered to open because nobody was going to call my name. I had been doing this for 11 years. Not because the work wasn't good, the work was exceptional. I could hear a 0.2 decibel imbalance in a mix that 3 other engineers had already approved. I had an instinct for what a song needed in its bones that certain producers would quietly describe as a gift and then very carefully not mention in interviews. But being excellent at something invisible is a specific kind of life. You learn to disappear into it. The edges of yourself go soft. And one day you look up and realize you have spent 11 years making beautiful things no one knew you had touched, and you're not entirely certain you remember how to be seen. She was the one who noticed the folding chairs were stacked wrong. Everyone else at the reception, the 19 people who had gathered to mourn Marcus Hale on a gray Tuesday in Ohio, walked past the badly stacked chairs near the side wall without registering them. I noticed, because I noticed the details other people don't bother with. Occupational damage. But she noticed them before I did. And she didn't say anything to anyone. She just walked over quietly while the pastor was still speaking to a cluster of older relatives and began unstacking them and refolding them correctly, alone, without looking up to check if anyone had seen her do it. Some people are so accustomed to fixing things without being asked that they don't even register it as a choice anymore. I registered it immediately. I should have walked over. I should have offered to help. Instead, I stood near the refreshment table with a cup of weak coffee I wasn't drinking and watched her work with the focused efficiency of someone who was, perhaps, possibly doing something with her hands because standing still in that room was costing her more than she wanted to show. That's what I noticed first. Not her, the cost of standing still. I would think about that for a long time before I understood what it said about me. My father's name was Robert Morrow, and he was, for the most part, a steady man. Not warm, not cold, steady. The kind of father who showed up to things and said the right things and kept the garage meticulously organized and believed that most problems, given enough time, would arrive at a reasonable resolution on their own. He had been a civil engineer for 32 years. He died in March, 11 months before the Tuesday I'm describing. The last coherent thing he said to me, past the medications, past the small institutional indignities of that hospital room, past the untouched lunch tray turning cold on the swing arm table, was a name. Marcus Hale. He was my roommate for 3 years at Millbridge. We had a falling out. I was wrong, and I never fixed it, and I have thought about it for 37 years. His wife died last spring. He has a daughter. When the time comes, I want someone from this family to be there. I said, of course. What I meant was, I love you, and I'm sorry, and please don't die. But my father and I shared the same instinct for saying the manageable thing instead of the true one, and it was too late in that room to unlearn it. He died 4 days later. So 11 months after that, I flew from Nashville to a mid-sized city in Ohio. I had never visited, drove a rental car to a Lutheran church I had difficulty finding on the map, and sat in a pew next to strangers mourning a man I had met exactly twice, both times when I was 9, at summer barbecues that blurred together in memory. I brought a sympathy card with money in it because my mother always said that was what you did. I sat through a service for a quiet man who had loved birds and woodworking and, based on his daughter's eulogy, had spent his last years teaching himself to cook, not for anyone in particular. His daughter said softly, just because he wanted to learn something new, just because he decided he wasn't finished yet. She delivered that eulogy without notes, and the precision of it, the way each sentence arrived exactly where it was supposed to, was the particular precision of someone who had been preparing for a very long time and understood that no amount of preparation would make it adequate. There were 19 people in that church. I was deeply, specifically out of place in the way only a stranger at a small funeral can be present enough to be noticed, unknown enough to be mildly suspicious. That was when I first saw her, or rather, her back moving toward the badly stacked chairs before anyone else had registered they were badly stacked. I ended up beside her 20 minutes later because everyone else had drifted toward the cluster of Marcus Hale's old colleagues near the windows, and the space by the side wall had become quieter. She was writing something in a notepad she'd drawn from her bag. Small, black cover, coffee-stained at the lower right corner in a way that looked like one specific accident rather than general wear. It was open to a page, maybe 2/3 through, and from where I stood, I could see that the page had one line of handwriting near the top and then nothing, just clean white space below it. The emptiness of something stopped mid-thought. She didn't close the notepad when she noticed I was nearby. She just held it at her side, loosely, the way you hold something you've given up, pretending is hidden. "Are you family?" she asked, not looking up right away. "No," I said. "My father was an old friend of his, a long time ago." I hesitated. "Are you?" Her expression shifted slightly. "I knew him through work," she said, and then paused and seemed to weigh something. "I'm here in a professional capacity." The sentence was careful, too carefully assembled to be a complete answer. I recognized that architecture, it was the structure of someone who knew more than they were offering. "What does that mean at a funeral?" I asked. She looked at the notepad, then tucked it back into her bag. "It means I'm not entirely certain how much of what I know I'm permitted to feel," she said. "So I came in an official capacity, and I'm hoping the rest of it sorts itself out." That was a more honest sentence than most people offer a stranger in the first 2 minutes. I recognized a specific kind of exhaustion behind it, not carelessness. The particular fatigue of a person who had been careful for so long they had temporarily run out of the energy it required. "I didn't really know him at all," I said. "I'm here because my father couldn't be." "Did it help?" she asked. And the question was genuine, not polite, genuine. I thought about it, which I suspect she noticed. "I think it was supposed to help him," I said. "He's dead." I'm not sure what it did for me. Something crossed her face then, soft and disbelieving. The first movement of a smile before she decided whether to allow it. It didn't quite arrive, but I saw it trying to. She told me her name. Maren Calloway. Said it like a person accustomed to spelling it. I gave her mine and she nodded once. And the quiet that settled between us afterward wasn't the uncomfortable kind, not the kind that needs filling. It was the loaded kind. The kind that happens when two people have accidentally told each other something true before the small talk had a chance to intervene. Then the last guests began their goodbyes. Handshakes, coats, the particular efficiency of people ready to return to their lives. The hall thinned. The chairs near the sidewall still hadn't been properly stacked. We both saw it at the same moment. Without discussing it, we worked quietly, neither of us filling the silence with anything. It was the kind of quiet that had weight, not dead, not awkward, just present. By the time the last chair was folded and stacked correctly, we were the last two people in the church hall. The afternoon light was coming through the high windows at a low November angle, pale and specific. "Well," Maren said. "That's done." "That's done," I agreed. She picked up her bag. I picked up my coat. We walked out into the cold parking lot, and at some point between the door and her car, she mentioned she was staying at the Courtyard downtown before her flight the next morning. I mentioned the same hotel because I was, in fact, staying at the same hotel, which was the only one near the church that hadn't looked structurally compromised on the booking website. She smiled at that. Not the almost smile from inside. A real one, quick and involuntary, arriving before she could route it through anything more controlled. "Then I'll probably see you at breakfast," she said. "Probably," I said. She got into her car. I stood in the parking lot for a moment in the cold Ohio air, holding my coat instead of wearing it, listening to the sound of her rental engine turning over. I told myself, hoping to see her at breakfast. That was not entirely true. The hotel breakfast was not supposed to be anything. I went down at 7:40 because I had a flight at 11, and because I was not, I want to be clear, hoping to see her again. I was going to have coffee, eat something forgettable, and return to Nashville having completed one errand my father had asked of me. Maren was already there, seated at a corner table near the window, the notepad open in front of her, a cup of coffee untouched at her right hand. The same page, the same single line near the top, the same white space below it that seemed to be waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. I paused at the entrance to the breakfast room. This is the part where a smarter man would have found a table on the other side of the room. Not because he didn't want to sit with her, because he did, and recognized the difference. I chose a table on the other side of the room. She looked up and found me immediately. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she tilted her chin very slightly toward the empty chair across from her, and I came over because apparently self-awareness is not the same thing as self-control. The waiter appeared. He looked at Maren and began describing the special, a scrambled egg situation with several unnecessary components. And she listened to the whole thing politely, without interrupting. Then she opened the menu, read it in its entirety, including the section at the bottom about allergens and substitutions, and ordered exactly what she had clearly already decided she wanted before he'd opened his mouth. "You read the whole menu," I said, when he left. "Even after he described the special." "I always read the whole menu," she said. "Even at diners?" "Especially at diners." She lifted her coffee. "Diners have more variables." I started to respond and then stopped myself. Because what I wanted to say was that I found this specific and excellent and somehow completely unsurprising, and that felt like too much information to volunteer at 7:43 inches in the morning in an Ohio hotel. "What's in the notepad?" I asked instead. Her hand moved to it briefly, not pulling it closer, just touching the cover. "Nothing finished," she said. That was all. The sentence arrived, and she didn't expand on it, and the quiet that followed had texture to it, not the absence of something. The presence of something both of us had silently agreed not to press. We talked for 40 minutes. I told her about the studio, about the albums, about being excellent in small print. She laughed once, soft and disbelieving, like I'd said something that shouldn't have been funny, but somehow was, when I described watching the Grammy ceremony alone with an unopened beer. "You watched the whole thing?" she asked. "I fell asleep during the last category," I said. "That's almost dignified," she said, which was the right answer. I liked her for it with an immediacy I hadn't been ready for. She told me she was a forensic accountant. She found things in numbers that people had tried to make unfindable discrepancies, patterns, the financial equivalent of a 0.2 decibel imbalance that 3 other engineers had already signed off on. I said that out loud, the comparison, and she looked at me across the table for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the sentence warranted. "That's exactly what it is," she said. Such a quiet sentence. It settled in my chest with the weight of something recognized. We exchanged numbers in the parking lot at our respective rental cars, with the Ohio morning cold and pale around us. She tucked her phone away and looked at the church across the lot. "I'm glad you came," she said. Not quite to me. To the morning. To some version of how the day had arranged itself. "Yeah," I said. "Me too." She drove away. I stood beside my car until her rental disappeared at the end of the block, not because I was watching her go, but because I needed a moment to put something back where it belonged before I got in the car and pretended the last 18 hours had been ordinary. They had not been ordinary. I came home to Nashville and spent 3 weeks telling myself the breakfast had been pleasant but inconsequential. The kind of thing that happens between strangers who meet at a funeral and will almost certainly never share a county again. A good anomaly. Still an anomaly. On day 4, she texted me a photo of a diner menu in Chicago. The allergens section, specifically, no caption. I laughed out loud in my apartment at 11 in the morning. On day 9, we were on the phone for 2 hours, and I was sitting on my kitchen floor because I'd started the call standing and then gradually lost the structural argument for standing. We talked about her work, the way financial fraud told a story if you knew how to read the pattern, the way most people who hide something believe they're the first to think of the method. We talked about my father and the guilt he'd carried for 37 years and whether it was possible to make peace with something on someone else's behalf. She said she thought it might be if you were honest about the fact that you were doing it for yourself too. I said I was going to think about that. She said, "Good." By week 3, I had stopped pretending the days I knew I'd hear from her weren't different from the days I didn't. I hadn't said that out loud yet, but I knew the difference. I had known it for longer than 3 weeks. Cliff Danner's retirement party was held on the last Friday in October in the rooftop event space of a hotel in Midtown Nashville. 200 people, studio clients, collaborators, the full web of music industry adjacents who collected these events the way silt collects at the bends of rivers, useful, unavoidable, slightly obscuring the bottom. I had worked for Cliff for 11 years. He was 62, silver-haired, broadly loved, in the way men who never raise their voice in public tend to be broadly loved. And he had a gift I had spent 11 years quietly cataloging, the gift of receiving credit for other people's work without appearing to have taken it. He didn't do it crudely. There was no theft in it, exactly. When journalists called, he answered thoughtfully. When producers asked who had shaped a mix, he would say something like, "We really found it in the room together," which was technically accurate in the sense that a room is technically wherever the most important person happens to be standing. My name was in the liner notes. He never removed it. He simply had a talent for standing between a question and the answer it was looking for. 11 years. I had accepted this arrangement the way you accept the ambient noise of a city you live in, not because it doesn't bother you, but because arguing with the ambient noise of a city is an exhausting and losing proposition. I was paid well. The work was exceptional. I had convinced myself this was enough, mostly because the alternative required a kind of self-assertion. I had never found a comfortable path to. The party was the kind of event where toasts unfold in a predictable sequence. Catered dinner, career highlights on a screen. I appeared in 3 photographs and was not identified in any of them. And then the portion of the evening where people who had benefited from Cliff's orbit stood and said so. I was expected to be one of them. Not because Cliff had asked me directly. He hadn't needed to. It was the structure of the thing. I was the senior engineer, the one who had been there longest, the natural, obvious, unspoken choice for the toast that would stand as the fullest endorsement of the man and everything he was leaving behind. Every person in that room understood this. I had known it for 3 weeks. I had been composing and silently discarding versions of that toast for 11 years without knowing that's what I was doing. Maren was there because she had been brought in by the acquiring firm to conduct financial due diligence before the studio's ownership transfer completed in January. This was the second time I had encountered her in a professional capacity, which meant I was beginning to understand that professional capacity was where she went when she wanted to be somewhere without fully committing to being somewhere. I saw her near the bar when I arrived. She had a glass of something sparkling she wasn't drinking, and she was reading something on her phone with the focused attention of a person who has arrived at an event and would like credit for attending without being required to fully attend. She looked up when I got close. Something shifted in her expression. Not the almost smile from the hotel. Not the quick involuntary one from the parking lot. Something steadier than both. The kind of look that means you're here with a specific weight on the you. Official capacity? I said, always, she said. Then, quietly, just for me, "It's very good to see you, Joel." I hadn't heard my name said quite like that in longer than I could cleanly account for. The toast began at 9. Cliff stood at the front of the room in a good suit, looking the way powerful men look when they are the occasion magnanimous, slightly moved, completely at ease. The first 2 toasts were clients. The third was his business partner. Then the MC, his longtime assistant, Dara, looked at me across the room. Cliff looked at me. The room looked at me. Cliff reached out his hand with the microphone in it, extending it in my direction across 12 feet of carpet with the complete confidence of a man who has never once considered that a gesture of his might go unmet. 11 years. 11 years of ambient noise. I sat down, not dramatically, no statement attached. I simply took the weight off my feet and put it in the chair behind me, hands in my lap, eyes on the middle distance. A clean, quiet, total refusal. The room went still. Not loud still. The specific still of 200 people recalibrating at the same moment. Cliff's hand held the microphone in the air for a long second, the gesture extended, unanswered. Then Dara moved smoothly, said something transitional, and the evening continued without me. I did not look at Cliff. I looked at Maren. She was watching me from across the room with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Not surprise. Not the particular warmth I had been, I will admit, hoping for. Something more careful than both. She set her untouched sparkling glass on the bar and moved toward me with the unhurried deliberateness of someone approaching a situation they have decided to examine. She stopped beside my chair. "What was that?" she said. I sat down. I said, I know what you did. Her voice was level, the voice she used for facts. I'm asking why you did it here, in front of everyone, instead of telling him privately. And I looked up at her, because privately doesn't count. Something moved behind her eyes. She held the answer at arm's length and looked at it from different angles. You didn't need an audience to make it real, she said. Or was the audience for yourself? The question arrived with precision. Not unkindly, she wasn't trying to wound me. She was asking something genuine, and she wanted a genuine answer, and she was not going to accept the version that made me uncomplicated. I thought about it honestly, my thumb pressed against my knuckle under the table. Both, I said. Probably. She considered that for a moment. Then something in her posture shifted, not softening exactly, but opening a degree or two, the way a window opens when the pressure inside and the pressure outside finally match. Okay, she said, quietly, almost to herself. Okay. She sat down in the empty chair beside me. Not the way an ally sits beside you, not to signal anything to the room. The way someone sits when they've decided to remain in a situation they haven't finished understanding. The toasts continued. Cliff said something gracious and long. I registered none of it. I was thinking about what she'd asked was the audience for yourself, and about the fact that it was the first honest question anyone in that room had aimed in my direction all evening, maybe in 11 years. Her bag was on the floor beside her chair. The notepad was inside it, corner visible. Same coffee stain. Same unfinished page. Neither of us mentioned what had just happened in the room. That was a certain kind of silence, too, the kind that follows a sentence that landed somewhere deeper than it was supposed to. Not comfortable, not loaded, just true. That was the problem. It was also, I realized, the beginning of something I had been trying not to name. The night ended late, after the toasts completed and the crowd thinned. Maren and I stayed at our table at the edge of the rooftop event space for longer than either of us could professionally justify. The city spread below the windows. Catering staff moved around us with the practiced invisibility of people accustomed to being background in arrangement I recognized and appreciated. He's going to be angry, she said. Yes. Is that a problem? I thought about it. I don't know yet. I know it wasn't a mistake. She turned her glass slowly. There's a version of that which is brave, she said, and a version that's just damage finally finding an exit. I looked at her. Which version do you think this is? She held my gaze for a moment. Both, probably, she said. The way she said it, not as judgment, just as fact, was giving me back the same honest answer I'd given her earlier in the evening, a kind of reciprocity. I'll match you. If you go real, I go real. That was when I understood she was dangerous. Not specifically to me. In general, the kind of person whose precision applied to the interior of another person's life could locate things they hadn't known were there. She had a cab at 11. I walked her out through the lobby and we stood on the sidewalk in the October cold while her phone pulled up the booking. And neither of us said the obvious thing, and neither of us said the other obvious thing either. She got in the cab. I watched it turn left at the end of the block before I went back inside to find my coat. The weeks after that had a quality I don't have the right word for, not anticipation exactly, more like the feeling of walking towards something in low light. You can't see it clearly yet, but your body knows the ground is changing underfoot. We talked most evenings, not every evening, not with any formal arrangement, just her name on my screen or mine on hers, and an hour that expanded to 2 without either of us noticing the expansion. She was working the studio audit, which meant she was in Nashville 3 days a week. And on those days, we had dinner once and walked somewhere once, and I drove her back to her hotel twice, and both times sat in the car outside the entrance, longer than the situation required. I had stopped pretending I didn't know what this was. I had simply not found the specific courage yet to say it out loud. The almost moment happened on a Wednesday. She had been at the studio all morning reviewing 11 years of financial records, which meant she had been, incidentally, reading 11 years of my professional existence in document form. When I arrived to meet her for lunch, she was in the lobby with her laptop and a coffee and her hair loose in a way it usually wasn't, and she looked up and said, "You've been underpaid for 9 years." I sat down across from her. I know, significantly. The margin on those 3 albums alone. Maren, she stopped. I know, I said again. She looked at me for a long, careful moment. Then she closed the laptop. You knew and stayed. Yes. Not because you couldn't leave. She was working out the structure of it. Because leaving required a kind of claim on your own work that felt uncomfortable, I said. It felt uncomfortable. Her mouth pressed together slightly. Not disapproval, something closer to recognition, the expression that crosses a person's face when they see something familiar in an unexpected place. I do that too, she said quietly. Not with money. She put the laptop in her bag, occupied her hands with the zipper. I stay inside the professional capacity because it gives me permission to be fully present without being fully present. The sentence landed and she seemed to notice it had gone further than she intended. She picked up her coffee, gave herself something to do with her hands. Lunch, she said. Lunch? I agreed, but the sentence stayed in the room between us for the rest of the afternoon. That was how it was with her. Things she said didn't dissipate. They accumulated. We went to a place she'd already researched. She had read the menu online before we arrived, confirmed the sourcing of 2 ingredients when the waiter came, and ordered with the specific confidence of someone who had completed their due diligence and was now prepared to enjoy the result. I had learned not to comment on this, not because I found it excessive, but because watching her do it had become one of my quiet pleasures of the week. And explaining that would have required explaining too much else. Halfway through lunch, she mentioned her marriage. Not as a disclosure, just dropped it in the middle of a sentence about a client case, then kept going. Her ex-husband had been generous and inattentive in roughly equal measure for 8 years, she said. Large gestures, missed details. She had told herself the large gestures were the point until one day she understood that small details were actually the whole architecture of a life, and the gestures were just the part you photographed. I set my fork down. How long ago did it end? 4 years, she said. Long enough. She said it the way people say, I'm fine, which means they are fine, and also that fine is a word they have worked very hard to earn and would prefer you not inspect too closely. We walked after lunch. The afternoon had gone golden and cool. October Nashville doing its best impression of a city that knows how to be beautiful without effort. We found ourselves on a block with a used bookstore halfway down at Morrow, handwritten sign in the window, and we went in without discussing it. She moved through shelves the way she moved through everything, with direction, pausing exactly where she meant to, pulling things out to read the first page before returning them with a quiet verdict. I followed at half a step behind, not following exactly, just in the same orbit. We stopped at the same shelf at the same moment, history section. Our arms were side by side reaching for different books, and the space between us was small enough that when she turned her head to say something, she was closer than either of us had arranged for. She stopped mid-sentence. I didn't move. The bookstore went on around us, a customer in the back somewhere. The muffled sound of the street. For a full second, neither of us managed the next thing. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Something about the audit. She stepped back 1/2 step, not in retreat, not dramatically, just enough for the moment to become a different kind of moment, answered the message, and we found ourselves at the register 3 minutes later buying books we'd half forgotten choosing. Outside, she was quiet. Not uncomfortable, quiet. The weighted kind. I walked her to her rental car, 2 blocks from the bookstore, on a side street, filling up with late afternoon shadow. At the car, she put the books on the passenger seat, then stood with the door open, not yet getting in. She looked at me across the door frame. Joel, she said, and stopped, because she had begun the sentence before she'd decided what it contained. I waited. Nothing, she said. I'll call you tonight. She got in. I stood on the sidewalk in the October shade and told myself with rapidly diminishing conviction that I was handling this well. She called 3 days later instead of that night. I noted this and did not mention it. The call was easy. Her voice had the warmth it got when she was tired from traveling and had given up performing anything. We talked about nothing significant for 40 minutes. I sat on my back steps in the cold because I needed the air. At some point, she said she had to go. We said goodnight, and I stayed on the steps afterward for longer than the cold justified. The following Tuesday, she was back at the studio for the audit. I arrived early, not because I had any reason to be at the studio at 8 inches the morning, not because I was hoping to see her before the day properly started. Both of those things were true, but neither was the reason I told myself. The lobby was empty except for the receptionist, who waved me through. I went down the hallway toward the conference room she'd been using to drop something off, to check a setup, to have any reason at all for walking in that direction. I heard her voice around the corner before I reached it. She was on the phone, standing near the window at the end of the hall, back to me, unaware I was there. The voice she used on the phone was different from the one she used in person, less structured, more of her in it. I should have made a noise, cleared my throat, given her some signal. Instead, I stopped where I was, out of sight, and heard her say, "I'm not scared of him, Renee. That's the thing. I keep waiting for the scared part and it doesn't come. And that is significantly more frightening than scared." A pause. Her sister, talking. "Because scared, I know what to do with. Scared has a protocol. I read the contract. I identify the risk. I decide whether the exposure is acceptable." A shorter pause. Her voice dropped. "He doesn't try to fix things. He just stays in the same room as the problem with me." Do you understand how disarming that is after 8 years of large gestures? Her sister said something. "I know," Maren said finally, softer than everything before it. "I know I need to finish the sentence. I've been trying." I took one step back, carefully, and walked to the coffee station at the other end of the hall. I poured a cup with hands that were not entirely steady and stood there for 2 full minutes staring at the wall. She had a notepad with one unfinished sentence on the last written page. She'd been trying to finish it. I set the coffee down, picked it up, set it down again. I had been waiting to know whether what I felt was appropriate or misplaced, or some elaborate confusion born of loneliness and proximity. I had been managing that uncertainty with patience and some dignity, I thought. With the same careful, competent invisibility I applied to everything that mattered to me. That was finished now. 4 days is a specific length of time to carry someone else's private words. I turned the sentence over like an object in my hands he stays in the same room as, the problem with me examining it from every angle, the way she must examine financial records, looking for the pattern beneath the pattern. I knew what it meant. I had known the moment I heard it. The 4 days weren't uncertainty. They were me finding the exact shape of what I needed to say back. I had spent 4 days not calling what I felt by its proper name, the way you don't press a bruise to confirm it's there. I knew it was love, had known it, I think since Ohio, since the church parking lot in November, and a woman who fixed chairs without being asked. I just hadn't been ready to say a word that required something back. On the 4th evening, I texted her, "Are you at the hotel?" "Studio," she replied. "Late session. Can you stay another hour? I want to play you something." The pause before her reply lasted longer than the message warranted. Then, okay. The control room was mine in a way no other space in my life was mine. Dark, deliberately so. Padded walls, the low warm glow of the console, monitors tall on either side of the desk like a frame around the world. I had spent 11 years in rooms like this making other people's work sound the way it was supposed to sound, and I had never brought anyone here who wasn't being paid to be there. Not because I was precious about it, because it had never occurred to me to. The room was work. Work was invisible. The 2 halves of that sentence had been pointing in the same direction for longer than I had noticed. Maren knocked at the outer door at 8:47. I let her in and she stepped into the dim light and looked around slowly, taking inventory the way she took inventory of everything, not performing curiosity, just actually curious. "This is yours," she said. "Yes." She walked to the console and examined the rows of faders without touching them. These are the albums. Some of them, she turned and looked at me. The light in that room was specific, warm and low, the kind that softens everything without obscuring anything. She still had her coat on, bag over one shoulder. The notepad was in the outer pocket, coffee-stained corner visible. I could have picked that corner out of a lineup. "What did you want to play me?" she asked. I had something ready. I pressed play and the monitors filled with sound, a track I'd been working on for 3 weeks, for an artist whose name she would know, a song that had taken 11 different versions to find its shape. When I listened to it, I heard all the decisions no one would notice. That was always how I listened. But I wanted her to hear it the way someone hears music, not as a professional document, just as a thing that arrived and did something. We listened for 4 minutes without speaking. The room was good for that. It held sound the way it was designed to, cleanly, without interference. When it finished, the silence that followed was the comfortable kind. The kind we had gotten good at without formally arranging to. That's beautiful, she said. Yes, you did that. I did most of it. Nobody will know. Her jaw shifted slightly. Hell no, she said. The physical tell arrived before I could manage it, my hand pressing flat against the edge of the console, just to have something solid. Not because I was about to do something dramatic, because the sentence had landed somewhere specific and I needed a moment to absorb it. Maren, I said. Something in my voice made her go still. I had prepared a version of this, several versions. Precise, considered, the kind of thing you draft when you have spent 4 days with someone else's words and want to respond with appropriate care. What came out instead was this. I drove past my street twice before I parked tonight. She waited, not because I changed my mind, because I had been telling myself for 3 weeks that I was being patient. And tonight, I understood I had been confusing patience with cowardice. And I don't want to be the invisible version of this anymore. The room held the sentence. Maren's expression moved through several things I watched carefully. Surprise first, then something sharper, then something close to recognition. Joel. Her voice was careful. I'm not asking you for anything, I said. Not because I wasn't asking, because I needed her to understand the asking wasn't pressure. I stopped, started again. I have spent 11 years being excellent at something no one knew I was doing. And I kept telling myself I was fine with that until I understood that what I actually wanted was one person who knew, one person who listened for the thing underneath the obvious thing. My throat went tight. Every Tuesday, I told myself there was a professional reason to be here. There wasn't. There hasn't been for a long time. I'm here because of you. The silence that followed had a pulse. Then Maren let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and something more fragile, soft and broken at the edges, the kind that happens when a feeling you have been carrying too long finally gets put down somewhere. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. This is terrible timing, she said. I know. I have 11 more days on this audit. I know, and she gestured vaguely at herself. I'm not easy to be around. I read menus. I don't let people order for me. I keep a notepad with one unfinished sentence in it because I started writing something 4 years ago and I am apparently incapable of finishing it. I know, I said. She looked at me. You keep saying that because it's true. I stepped away from the console toward her, not all the way, not crowding her, just less distance. I know all of that, and I'm here anyway. Not because this is convenient or comfortable or makes any practical sense, because it's you. And I am very tired of being invisible about the things that matter to me. She looked at my face for a long moment. Her hand was at her side, slightly open the way hands are when a person is not quite gripping and not quite letting go. Then, quietly, I told my sister I need to finish the sentence. My breath stalled. The notepad, she said. I told her I'd been trying. She studied my expression with the focus she gave everything that needed understanding. You already knew that. Not a question. I was walking down the hall. I said, you were on the phone. I should have. How much did you hear? I told her. All of it. The protocol sentence. The large gestures. Stays in the same room as the problem with me. Every word. For a moment, her expression was unreadable. Then something moved through it, the laugh that started somewhere in her chest and arrived late to her face. The kind that lives directly beside a feeling you've been carrying too long in a space that was too small. Soft and mortified and real. She covered her eyes briefly with one hand. 4 days, she said. 4 days. You carried that for 4 days and then invited me here to play me a song. I wanted to show you something that was mine first, I said. Before I asked you to believe anything else I said about myself. She lowered her hand. Her eyes were fully open, not tearful, just unfiltered, the way eyes look when a person has stopped managing what shows in them. She looked at me the way she had looked at those badly stacked chairs at Marcus Hale's funeral, noticing a thing that needed doing, deciding without announcement that she was going to do it. She crossed the 2 steps between us. Her hand came up and settled against my jaw, cool fingers, the particular firmness of a person who does not do tentative things, and she kissed me. Not cautiously, not as a question, as an answer to something that had been asked in different ways since a church parking lot in November. I put my hands at her waist and she pressed closer and the room, which I had spent 11 years keeping perfectly controlled and professionally neutral, held us both in its low, warm light and said nothing about it. When we finally separated, her forehead rested against mine. "You should have said something sooner," she murmured. "You should have finished the sentence sooner." A sound came from her that was most of a laugh. Fair. We stayed like that for a while. The monitors were dark. The console was dark. Outside, the building was late evening, empty. Nashville going about its business without us. I was aware of her breathing, of her hands still loosely at my lapels, of the specific quality of the quiet between us, not loaded now, not weighted, just honest, the kind that doesn't need anything done to it. "I need to go back to the hotel," she said eventually. Not retreating, just true. "I know." She stepped back, but her hand found mine on the way and held it for a moment, specific, deliberate, before she let go and picked up her bag. At the door, she paused. "Joel." I looked at her. "The sentence in the notepad," she said. "I know how it ends now." She left before I could ask what it said. I sat in the dark control room for 20 minutes after the door closed, not mixing anything, not adjusting anything, just sitting in a room that had been professional for 11 years and was now something else entirely, feeling for the first time in longer than I could honestly measure, like a person whose name belonged on the record. She texted me at 7:14 the next morning. "I told the partner firm I needed to recuse from the portions of the audit where your work is documented. It'll delay things by a week. I wanted you to know I handled it." I read that sentence twice. Not because it was complicated, because of what it represented the first time I had seen her do something professionally inconvenient because of something personal. The first time she hadn't managed it under the cover of official capacity. I typed back, "Thank you for telling me." She sent a single period in response, which I had learned by then meant "you're welcome" in the specific language she used when she didn't want to make something smaller by explaining it. I found out about the rest of it from Dara. 2 weeks later, in the studio hallway, Cliff's former assistant, now staying on through the transition, stopped me on my way to the booth and said carefully that Maren had flagged her concerns about the credit structures in my contracts to the incoming ownership. "Not as part of the audit," Dara said. "Separately. After the audit was closed, as a professional observation, attributed only to her own review." I stood in the hallway for a moment. "She didn't tell you," Dara said. "It wasn't a question." "No." Dara looked at me with the expression of someone who has been paying attention to things in this building for a long time. "The new owners are going to restructure your agreement," she said, before the transfer. I thanked her and walked to the far end of the building and stood near a window with my hands in my pockets, looking at nothing, understanding that Maren had spent professional capital she didn't owe me, quietly, without mentioning it, without making a gesture of it, not a large gesture, the small detail kind, the whole architecture kind. I called her from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring. "Joel, you flagged the contracts," I said. A pause. I saw a discrepancy. It fell outside the scope of the audit, but it needed to be noted. "Maren," she was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said softly. "I know what it was. Why didn't you tell me?" She considered the question with the specific patience she gave, things that deserved it. "Because I didn't want you to feel owed something," she said finally. "I wanted to just do it, without it being a transaction." A pause. "Is that all right?" I leaned back against my car in the cold December parking lot. My chest ached in the good way, the way that means something is opening rather than closing. "Yes," I said. "That's more than all right." On the other end of the line, I heard her breathe. Then, quietly, something that might have been relief. She finished the audit and went back to Chicago the week before Christmas. The distance had a texture I hadn't expected, not painful exactly, more like the feeling of a room you've gotten used to that suddenly has a door in it. Present even when closed. I drove up twice in January. She flew down once in February. Stayed 4 days. Left a coffee mug on my counter she didn't mention, and I didn't move. We did not make formal declarations about what we were. We didn't need to. What we were was visible in the small accounting of it. The contact in my phone, I checked before I checked anything else in the morning. The running conversation that had no beginning and no plan to end. The specific way The week organized itself differently around the days I knew I'd hear her voice. In March, she told me her lease in Chicago was up in June. I said I had a spare room she could use while she looked for something in Nashville. She said she was a forensic accountant and I was a terrible liar. I said that was fair. She moved in June, officially, with boxes in a rented van and the specific efficiency of a person who has packed and unpacked enough times to have a system. I helped carry things up the stairs, and she directed the arrangement with the decisive competence she applied to everything. And at some point between the second bookshelf and the kitchen boxes, she laughed at something. I said, not the polite smile, not the quick involuntary one, not the mortified laugh from the control room. This was the full version, the one that started somewhere deep and arrived without permission, that took her whole face and briefly made her lean against the door frame to stabilize, that I had not heard before in exactly this form. That laugh, I understood something that I hadn't had words for yet. Not a new thing, something I had been carrying in pieces and hadn't assembled until that moment in a half-unpacked hallway. I understood that I was going to spend a very long time trying to be funny enough to hear it again, and that I was completely at peace with that as a project. The notepad appeared on my counter one evening in October, 4 months after she moved in. She was cooking. She had taken up cooking with the same thorough, researched commitment she applied to everything. And our kitchen smelled most evenings like something she had decided to understand. And I was at the table reading, and I looked up and the notepad was there between us. Black cover, coffee stained corner. She had put it down while she was moving between the counter and the stove and left it without ceremony. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at her. The old page is gone, she said, without turning around. I picked it up. The first page now was blank. The coffee-stained corner was still there, but the page she had written on the one with the single unfinished sentence had been removed neatly, deliberately. I set the notepad down. A few minutes later, she came to the table to refill my glass, and on her way back to the stove, she put something beside my hand, a folded piece of paper, torn edges on 2 sides. I looked at it. She was already back at the stove, her back to me, giving me the privacy of the moment without making a production of giving it. I unfolded the paper. She had started the sentence 4 years ago, the night her marriage ended. I could see where the original writing stopped, where she had put the pen down and not come back. And below that, in the same handwriting, but with a slightly different pressure of a different night, a different year, a different person finishing a different version of themselves. She had finished it. I read it twice. My throat was tight. I folded the paper along its original crease and held it for a moment, and then I put it in my shirt pocket, close. Hey, I said. She turned. I stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and put my arms around her from behind, carefully, so she could keep cooking, my chin at her shoulder. She covered my forearm with her hand. Neither of us said anything. The low hum of the stove, the October dark outside the window, the smell of something good. This was the architecture of it, the small detail kind, the whole structure kind. We stayed like that until the timer went off. I think about Marcus Hale sometimes, a quiet man in Ohio who loved birds and woodworking, and at the end had been teaching himself to cook for no one in particular, just because he decided he wasn't finished yet. I think about my father, who carried a 37-year silence and handed the repair of it to me in a hospital room, because he understood at the end that the longer you wait to fix something, the more it costs someone else. I think about a church parking lot in November, 2 strangers folding metal chairs at the end of a small funeral, one of them with an unfinished sentence in her bag. I had spent 11 years making beautiful things that no one knew I had touched. 11 years of excellent, invisible work that I told myself was enough because the alternative was claiming something out loud, and I had never found a comfortable way to do that. Maren was the first person who asked what I heard, not what I made, not what the album sounded like, not what the artist wanted, not what the brief required. What I heard in the space between the notes, in the room before anyone else arrived, she asked, and then she waited for the real answer. That's the whole story. Not the funeral, not the control room, not the retirement party, or the missed toast, or the folded page in my shirt pocket. The whole story is that a woman who read every contract before she signed it, looked at me, and waited and did not let me give her the manageable version. Some people make you audible to yourself. I didn't know that was what I'd been missing until I heard myself clearly for the first time in 11 years. Have you ever kept something unfinished because completing it would have meant admitting it mattered? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needed to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one.